Whenever there is a victim of a police shooting, we many times hear from the female relatives of the victim. But what do the male relatives have to say? Find out on Talking with Henrietta, coming up next. Hi, I'm Henrietta. Welcome to the show. Over the past few years, the public has seen many news reports and protests over the shootings of unarmed men by the police. These shootings of mostly Black men led to the Black Lives Movement. In many cases, we have seen the reactions expressed by the mothers, wives, sisters, and sometimes children of the victims. But we seldom see reports with the victims' male relatives that show how they are dealing with their experience of loss. On this show, I will talk to the relatives of two victims of police shootings. On my far left is Cephas Johnson, also known as Uncle Bobby X, who is the uncle of Oscar Grant, who was shot at the Fruitvale BART station 10 years ago. Seated to my right is Richard Perez, who is the father of Richard Petey Perez, who was shot by police in Richmond in 2014. We may have another guest, J.T. Faraji, who is a social activist and artist from East Palo Alto. In the meantime, I'd like to thank the two of you very much for being with me. I'm delighted that you've been able to join me. And I'm just wondering, for the two of you, do you feel that men have been and still are being shortchanged when it comes to being able to express their emotions in public?
I guess if I was to answer that question, I would say, first, out of love and respect for mothers, we cannot mute their voice. They carried us for 9 months, nursed us, was the first teacher that, me and looking at my mother, taught me everything that I know. Of course, my father played a role in that also. But in many ways, when it comes to addressing this issue, when you lose a loved one, many times we are left out of the conversation. Many times I feel that we are in pain also, and yet we have to find ways to how to express it, and it's never really given the opportunity to express our pain more so like the mother.
What do you feel? Do you agree with that, Richard?
I agree with it a whole bunch. Hardest part for me is watching my wife cry every night for it's been over 4.5 years, and it just nonstop, and then me having to come to do things like this and all these other things. We were up in Sacramento on Monday to work on Assembly Bill 392, and we, me and Cephas have been many different places together. I've been many different places by myself as well as he has, but and my wife sits home alone. She wants to participate a lot of times, but a lot of times this stuff's very depressing to her. So, like I say, the hardest part for me is, well, of course I miss my son. Even just coming here today, I'm a truck driver, and my son also drove with me. We often rode together, and later on he took over the routes we do by himself. But just driving up the street, I just have visions of him being with me, and stuff like that. So Yeah, I do feel the emotional part of it quite often. Again, no, the hardest part is watching my wife cry every day. We had a hard time, or she had a hard time conceiving, and
Was he your only?
he was our only child, period, yeah. So, it looked like uh, we might not have our child for the longest time. She had to go to a fertility clinic and the whole 9 yards on that. But and then all of a sudden, the miracle baby was there.
Oh,
So she was, as anyone would be, was very happy, and and raising him. You know, I often said that first comes Petey, my son, then come her dogs, and then I came in maybe third, you know. So, so now we still got the dogs,
yes.
but I still got to support her emotionally quite often, and she has a lot of breakdowns.
Sure. Now, JT, come on over and join us. Thank you so much
right, how you
for
doing?
coming.
Yeah.
You probably missed the question I had asked if men feel that they've been shortchanged when it comes to expressing their emotions in public, or just expressing their emotions.
I think people express their emotions in different ways. I think that emotion, in at least in this society, as far as if we're gonna put genders on it, I think men are probably taught more to hide their emotions or disguise their emotions. I think some emotions are looked at as less masculine than other emotions. So, yeah.
Has anything changed? Did anything change with you when your nephew was killed?
I'm not quite sure if I understand the question clearly.
The idea of openly expressing your emotions. JT said that men sometimes feel the obligation to hide their emotions because they're men. There is this idea that men are tough and shouldn't cry.
That's interesting because when Oscar was first murdered, I can remember just being in pain and actually tearing up. And because I was going to various schools, colleges, and places to speak, and community events to speak, when I thought about him and the love that we had together, it immediately brought up tears. And I can remember at sometimes feeling a little embarrassed, you know, and so, but what I've learned from that it was okay to cry. Because there was times when I thought that I needed to hold my composure, speak boldly about what happened to Oscar in a way that wouldn't give an indication with that false thought that it might weaken me. But actually, it actually helped build me up and bring clarity, I believe, to the issue, and not being afraid to cry when it hit me helped me grow to better deal with the situation than to take it upon myself and be more destructive to myself versus letting it go.
So you're saying holding it in would have been far more harmful to you
I
than
believe.
releasing that pain through tears and
Right.
Now, Richard, you had said that you have to support your wife. You have to be there for her because
Yes.
she cries every night. What about yourself?
I don't know if you can see them. I got some tears in my eyes right now.
Ah.
It just helps paint the picture of pain, you know, that I feel all the time, and like I said, just different places I travel to in work is reminders of the life I had with him, and it's just, you know, hurtful to even just to go home and not see him eating all my food on the table, because I have my own appetite too, and you know how young men could be, they just love
Oh,
to eat.
yes.
So it is very painful. One thing I have noticed is when I talk to other men about it, you know, you get the man thing going, the hard shell, but I still don't hold back the tears when they're necessary, because it it's part of the pain, and they understand it. So it's a lot easier to talk to women about it, because they totally understand it. They just, the emotion thing kicks in immediately. It's, you know, they're the protectors of the world, and that's one thing my wife always does, is blame herself for not being there for him at that one moment. She also blames him being down at our work yard, which is a block and a half from where he got shot. But then again, that's what defined him. He was in a rough neighborhood, and we always told him, you know, watch out the way you talk to people, because who knows who's going to pull a gun out on you. And never in a million years thought it would be a police officer who would be the one that did it. So, you know, coming here and talking to you and doing all this activist stuff is my form of therapy. That's what works for me, to just, so this never happens to nobody else, because I'll never get what I want, which would be, you know, my son coming back, but at least not in this life. But I can point out issues that, you know, change the laws, and I'm not trying to bash the police, but I'm just trying to make them see the mistakes they're making that affect the whole community. They're hurting their own image.
Sure.
And
hurting a lot of people in
and
the
hurting
process.
a lot of people in the process. And it's not me doing it, and actually I'm trying my hardest to help them see the pain they're inflicting on me and my wife, and all these other families as well.
Now, let me give you a break and ask JT. Richard just now talked about helping them see the pain that they're causing. Do you think that's going to make a difference?
I definitely think it makes a difference, helping you know, the law enforcement community see the impact of you know, this type of violence. I think that police officers, individually and collectively, have a responsibility to the community and the greater society to police themselves in a certain kind of a way, so that this epidemic is not occurring. So unfortunately, this police violence, it's not like an isolated incident. It's happening everywhere. It's happening continually. It feels to me as though it's happening so much that news outlets are, by and large, it's like not even really making news anymore. It's becoming commonplace, and I think for the law enforcement community, that's what you don't want to happen. You know, if you're a police officer that you know, does his job, takes his job seriously, is responsible about his job, cares about the community, you should want to weed out or get rid of these officers just as much as everybody else, you know.
Yes, but it's not that easy, is it? Because there is that code of silence. and some officers might feel that they would be punished by their peers if they break that code of silence.
They are punished by their peers. They do get repercussions.
Yeah, to me, which is true, but to me it's the same situation. I had a police officer that is a friend of mine. I had a conversation with him maybe about a year ago, and he was saying, how come people from the community do not come forward, and when they know about an issue of community violence, and they know who did it, and they know what happened, how come they don't come and report that? And I said to this person, you know, for the same reason why you police officers in your department who go around and planting evidence on people, go around shooting people, don't go and turn in, you know, the good cops don't turn in the bad cop. So
did he have a response?
He didn't, and at least not one that I felt was acceptable. So I feel as though the same way, you know, people need to be accountable for their community. Police officers, the police officer community needs to be responsible for what they're doing. They can no longer just turn a blind eye to what's happening.
Well, we have a few pictures, a few photos of some of the young men who've been killed. And as those photos are brought up, I don't see any indication, quite frankly, in the news that any officers are reporting their colleagues. For example, in the Laquan McDonald case, where the police shot him
Falsified reports
16
and stuff.
times.
Yes.
And I think with Stephon Clark, who was shot at least 20 times. And there's Oscar Grant, and we're very familiar with him, his death on a BART train station by a police officer. So why don't we just go through the photos, because we're talking about real people. And the next photo we could see, and that's your son.
That's my son, yeah.
Yes, do you want to say anything about him, the circumstances of how he was shot by the police?
He was at the liquor store, which is at our neighborhood liquor store for my work yard, a block and a half from our yard. He knew everybody in the neighborhood. It's a predominantly black neighborhood, but he was known as the white boy. So he, even though we're Mexican, but he knows everybody there. And to this day, I go there, and everybody knows. They call me Petey's daddy and stuff. And so it's a community there, and sure, a lot of them like to sit around there and panhandle and drink beer and stuff in front of the store, which is what the police were going after that night. And
We can lose a picture.
so it's like the police, you know, like we mentioned here a few minutes ago about the law enforcement community, and they always come out there and talk about community policing. I think the police are the only ones that don't know who the community is, but everybody else knows who everybody is in the community.
Now, in his case, it was said that he had struggled with the police, and the police officer thought he was going to get his gun.
There are 6 witnesses that say he did not. And we had an activist friend of mine who, to me, coined the phrase, black witnesses matter. They did not take anybody's statement and it didn't mean nothing to them. actually, I listened to the audio of their statements of that night, and they say one thing about how here's the police officer saying that kid assaulted the officer at this point, and this girl says he never assaulted the officer assaulted him. And well, okay, so he assaulted the officer, then he goes on, I told you he did not assault the officer, and he just wrote that down anyway. And several other police reports, same thing. It's the police. I confronted the head of the police officers union, asked him, because he was one of the ones that wrote the reports. I said, why did you write down what you wrote when the girl you were interviewing explicitly said that he did not attack the officer? He said, well, her story kept changing. I said, well, then why didn't you write down the change in the story and write down the facts? Why did you interpret it to mean what you wrote on the thing? You know, it's not your place to interpret anything. You're supposed to write down the facts. And he just shrugged it off, and that's back to that the Blue Brotherhood or the federally sanctioned
Was there
gang.
a court case?
We had a civil suit, yes.
And did the witnesses, their testimony come up in the civil suit?
No, it ended up where we settled just because I didn't want my wife to be dragged through all the depositions and stuff, because that can get very ugly. They demonize my son. My son had a couple of incidences where he had unregistered weapons, but never using them. They were in his trunk or in his car, and but you know, people carry those things for protection. They don't carry them to commit crimes. And I always say my son didn't always follow the letter of the law, but he was not a criminal. So, but these police profile everybody that way.
Did the police officer who shot your son, did you ever talk with him directly?
I've had a few words back and forth. I actually took a picture of him in the federal courthouse, which is a big no-no, and the judge came up to me and scolded me a little bit about it, or maybe I should call her the hearing officer, but I said, well, yeah. She said, did you take a picture of him? I said, yes, I did. And she goes, well, you're not supposed to. You're in a federal courthouse. I said, well, I sure wish I would have known that. And she goes, well, you're going to have to erase that off your phone. And I said, that's fine. I don't know how to do it. You want to do it? And so I asked her, well, what about the 1,000 people I already sent it out to? She goes, oh my God. Oh, and she didn't say anything else after that. So I did send it out to a lot of people just because I knew that might happen.
But did you ever talk to him directly? Were you ever
no,
able to?
No, as far as I'm concerned, he's in God's hands now. And I just, if he isn't truly repentful, we all know where he's going to go. If he knows he made a mistake or is lying and stuff, then maybe I have that problem with God Almighty, that God's a forgiving God. But, you know, when I get right down to it, nothing's going to bring my son back in this life. So that's why my focus is on the police now and the lies they keep shoving down our throats, how they keep on with these false narratives and stuff. Just today in Sacramento, they had the kid with a spit mask on the news. And the cop talking to the public was saying how there's people out there that would demonize the police officers and make them, that they want to make them look bad and stuff. And that's not us. We're not making them look bad. They're making themselves look bad.
So you said a spit mask. For those who may not know, what's a spit mask?
The kid, a 12-year-old kid, apparently spit at the cop. And he's a 12-year-old kid, and there's a lot of other ways to deal with him. Speaking of 12-year-old kids, thank God he didn't get shot like Tamir Rice.
Yes.
But it's just, and there's issues with, like with Tamir Rice, the officer was known to be a firecracker, and he'd blow up in your face. And so I have the same issues with a cop that shot my son. He was known to have issues. I'm also finding out.
But he's still on the force?
No.
Oh, he's not.
He's out on post-traumatic stress disorder. He's getting paid $70,700 a year, plus cost of living increases, plus full benefits.
Is this a temporary?
I think it's permanent. Permanent disability, I think they called it. And it's only available to cops and firefighters. But what I take out of that, I try to remain positive. He's not a police officer no more.
Yes. Now, is there anything, we often hear in the news the statement, the idea of closure. When somebody dies, they say, well, this will bring closure. Is there ever closure?
There's never closure.
It changes form, but it's never closure.
Right. So I guess to give an example, some people say, well, he was arrested, right? And we'll talk about our particular case.
The person who shot
Johannes
Oscar.
Mesley, who murdered Oscar,
Yes.
did go to jail for 11 months.
Yes.
So the question was asked, well, how do I feel about that? Or could I forgive him? Well, he was really supposed to go to jail for 14 months. And had he maybe done the 14 years that he should have been doing, maybe then I might have felt that some form of justice was rendered. But it would have never closed the issue because, sadly, many young men that look like Oscar are still being murdered. So I can never forget or ever get closure because every 8 hours, another young black man is killed by the police.
Is it that often?
Right, it is that often. Well, you take 1,000 to 1,500 per year, and when I say per year, I'm including all races in that number. That average ought to be at least 3 to sometimes 4 a day, right? So if that's the case, then that means how can one ever get closure knowing that this madness still exists? I mean, in Oscar's case, we know for a fact, just here in the state of California, according to the Department of Justice use of force data collection, on an average, every year, 150 to 175 citizens of the state of California is murdered by the police. Well, if I times that by 10, right, I get at a minimum 12,000 has been killed by the California Police Department.
This is, you're saying just in California?
Just in California. I'm not talking about nowhere else. We're the most deadliest state in the country. And so on an average, we average between 100 and 150 civilians killed by the police in the state of California, just in the state of California. We're not talking about no other state. And if I times that by 10, we're talking about from the day Oscar was murdered on January 1st, 2009 to today, we're talking about at a minimum 1,000 and then at a maximum about 14,000.
Okay, now would you believe that, JT?
Absolutely.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds a lot like the facts and information that I've read or come across.
That sounds like an enormous amount of people.
It's a huge epidemic that's happening.
And what we should know is the outcome of those cases if they go to court or what happens to them.
See, I know that too. So in the state of California, only one case has ever been heard where an officer was found guilty for an on-duty shooting of a black or brown man where he was actually convicted.
Was that Meserly?
That was Johannes Mesley. He was
In California?
In the state of California. He's the only one. And remember, I mean, the number's larger outside the state. But in the state of California, only one conviction in the last 10 years. And so, you know, if we talk about our emotion in the struggle that we go through to ever, hopefully one day, find closure, that would have to be the grounding work to determine when maybe a family can get some closure. In knowing that police officers are now today being held accountable for the murders they commit. And as long as they are not held accountable, me as an uncle, I'm sure Richard as a father, and the mothers see another officer kill a Tamir Rice or a P.D. Perez, and it's a justifiable homicide, and we can say it's on video, like Stephon Clark, and he's shot in the back.
Several times?
Several times. That reopens the old wound that you
Yes.
have, so you can't find closure. And I think, you know, when I talk about us as men in our struggle to find how to deal with this emotionally, right? Being able to talk about it, you know, thank you for allowing us to be able to express ourselves in a table talk way about this struggle. Because for us, for me, it's a form of healing that takes place. It doesn't mean that I'm healed completely, because like I say, all day long, every time I hear about a shooting or killing, it reopens the wound. But at least I'm not bottled up with it.
So, before I talk about some of the legislation that you're working on,
I wanted to comment on what he
sure,
said.
sure.
His was on video, and
Oscar Grant's.
Oscar Grant's was, and of course they made a movie about it, the Fruitvale Station, and my son's was on video as well, but it's from inside the store looking out, but you could still see what happened for the most part. And you asked me earlier about witnesses and videos. There was 3 different videos outside the store. One of them, the girl said she took the whole thing all the way, and they didn't return her phone back for 2 years.
Was everything on it? Do you know when?
And magically, the memory card was missing. And they swear up and down there was never one in there. And here we go again with the police, you know, making up these false stories and stuff that they do. There was 2 other ones too, but these guys apparently were immigrants and didn't want to deal with it. And we actually caught up with them, but they still wouldn't do nothing about it. They didn't want their phone back. They didn't want to deal with it. But anyway, this day and age, everybody has a video camera in their pocket, and there were several videos, and it didn't help much. And
Now, I think, Richard, you were quoted as saying that there has been a lot of protests and public acknowledgement when it's someone who is black who's been killed, for the most part. And I think you said, but with your son, there was hardly any publicity at all.
I think it would have got a lot more attention had he been a black man. But although I have got some attention, and I guess we're riding on the coattails of black and brown.
Yes, but at the same time, I am thinking the fact that he was white would have made it more unusual. Would it have?
Maybe. The way I look at it is that he was in a black neighborhood, and the police feel that way. They profile everybody. You're in that neighborhood, you're just like the rest of them, and that's their profile of the neighborhood. And so therefore, that's why they did what they did.
I can add to that. When we think about it, I apologize for getting her name, but there was a white woman, I want to say in Ohio, I could be wrong on the state, that was killed by a Somalian police officer.
Yes.
In Minnesota.
Yes.
Minnesota.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And she had called them
Right.
because someone was being attacked in an alley.
Exactly.
Yes.
And supposedly he made a mistake. Well, my point is this. She was a white woman, a female, that we give high regards to as a society, and she was murdered by a police officer who was of color. And there was immediate action taken against that police officer, and eventually where also he was arrested for the shooting. And then of course, the civil case.
And I think he was convicted too.
And convicted.
He was, yes.
Yes, he
Right.
was.
Yes.
And then the civil case, she was awarded, I mean, an enormous amount of money. If I remember right, $20 million plus. But my point is this: when we talk about, we're sharing from the perspective of fathers, uncles, cousins, males that have been impacted by this violence, whether it's community violence or police violence. Our voice is normally silenced. And even when we talk about a white male being killed by the police, mass media is not going to advertise that to the degree that they advertise a black male being killed by the police, because the black male, they attach criminality to. The white male, especially if he has, they claim, some mental issue, will justify that shooting, and not so much justify it, but talk about him having these mental issues versus the criminality that might have been applied to it. But when we look at Petey's case, he was in a predominantly black neighborhood where they attach criminal activities to a neighborhood, and yet because of the story that he goes to is mainly of people of color, brown and black, he was murdered there, so it was a justifiable homicide, and therefore his advertisement of that case became mute because of the community. I don't know if that makes sense, but if you think about it, the white males that get killed around this country are not really advertised in a sense as they are black males, only because they don't attach their criminality to them.
The crime of blackness.
JT, what do you think? Before we
As
continue,
I was
Richard?
listening to Brother Cephas, to me it just reminded me of the crime of blackness. So take Mr. Perez's son, for example, is in a black community. So it's the crime of blackness, being surrounded by blacks and browns, being in that black environment. In the case that he was talking about in Minnesota, I believe it was a black police officer. So she was being awarded, and he got justly put in prison or whatever. But it was the crime of blackness. It's the
Do you
blackness.
think so? I mean, it seems to me when I read that case, there was, I don't want to say it seemed cut and dried, where she walked over to the police car on his side of the
What I'm talking
door, and he automatically just shot her.
Yeah, what I'm talking about is the fact
He could not
that
give a defense that he feared for his life.
I'm not saying at all commenting on that case. What I'm commenting on is the fact that that cop who was in this situation where he did wrong was actually punished. There are a lot of police officers that are white, non-black officers that get a smack on the wrist.
And there are some cases.
That's what I'm referring to.
Yes, and there are some cases where black officers are the perpetrators killing someone, and they also get a slap on the wrist.
One of the deceitful things that the Richmond Police Department did was immediately come out saying how the officer was a Latino officer who killed a Latino man. The officer spoke Spanish, all that. So they tried to justify it from that angle, and which has absolutely nothing to do with.
Except it wasn't racially motivated.
Well,
That's what they would have
That's what
said.
they were trying to pull out of it. That it wasn't. But again, it was the neighborhood that my son got profiled in. And it was a black thing again. So
we're talking about the coverage, right? The coverage is.
No, but he was profiled to be in that neighborhood, which is predominantly black. So therefore, he's one of the black guys, the bad guys, and that's what these police do constantly is profile whole neighborhoods and the war zone or whatever you want to call it. And even even military officers have rules of engagement where police officers got a license to kill, and.
So let's talk about those rules of engagement. There right now is, what is it? AB 392?
AB, yes,
Assembly Bill
392.
392.
You know, and right before we go there, I just wanted to make this comment when we talk about the criminality attached to the blackness of it. Had Petey, though he is brown, possibly been in a white suburban neighborhood, right, at a grocery store or Walmart, he may not have been murdered as fast, because it's just commonplace that we see all the time a white assailant that has been called upon, that actually is walking around with a rifle in his hand. These are just real examples. And the police will show up and talk him down. They would create space. They would create time.
Facts.
They may even call in a crisis intervention team. But they will not just immediately, within 10 seconds of their arrival, shoot him down. There's a video of Petey Perez and how he got killed. And yes, he walked into the liquor store. And when he walked out, you could see the officer. I think, if I remember correct, the officer came into the store. Petey walked out the store. He said something to him. And then next thing you know, you kind of see in the video, he's taken down to the ground. In the process, the officer eventually shoots and kills him. And then, of course, the story comes out that he was trying to take the officer's weapon, and he was fighting with the officer and what have you. I mean, this is based on my memory of reading about the case.
Yeah, there was a DNA test done on his weapon and on his holster and everything. No DNA on it. Yet, had there been DNA on it, they would have used it to all ends to bolster up their lie. But there was no DNA. I got to make that point right here. Mm-hmm. And my son was cooperating with the officer, sitting on the curb after the officer searched him. He was sitting on the curb, cooperating with him. He called 911 on the officer, and so they could hear the cops' radio in the background, so they said there's an officer there. So they hung up on him. 25 seconds later, the shot spotter goes off. So that's how quick everything happened. And they show a struggle in the video they have, but it's how they cleverly used the one video, which was a 10-second thing, and then she had to reset the camera, and then 10 more seconds. So it didn't show the actual shooting for that angle. And another deceitful thing I wanted to point out right now was this has happened 4.5 years ago, almost 5. September would be 5 years.
And your wife still cries every night?
Every night, every day, several times a day. And so here's icing on the cake here. They decide to release their version of the video the day after Mother's Day. Is that tacky or what? I mean, there's a whole lot of days they could have chose more than 4.5 years later to deal with that.
So
it's a calculated thing.
Let's go into how you handled this emotionally. Do you feel that there is a purpose to everything?
Well, we don't know God's plan, but
do you believe life is purposeful?
I feel that I was blessed to have my son for 24 years. And I thank God every day for that. And maybe it is purposeful that Uncle Bobby here has been doing this for 10 years, and I've been doing it for a solid 4 years now. And I can see how a lot of people get discouraged and stuff, but he's my inspiration, and that's all we're trying to do is bring the truth up, bring it out into the light, because what happens when you turn the light on a subject, on a dark room or something like that, a dark, dirty room, I should say, cockroaches scatter, and that's what's happening with these cops. We're turning lights on them, and they're scattering.
Do you think they're scattering, JT?
I definitely I would agree with that. I think also though that society as a whole, partially due to social media, has become desensitized to police violence. If you look at police violence in the 90s, when Rodney King was just beaten on camera, and the verdicts came back, half of Southern California was up in flames. Nowadays, when you have police shootings being shown on Facebook, not censored, I couldn't tell you how much stuff I've seen on there. I think just recently they started putting a button where you can watch if you choose to, but for a lot of that there was not that there. And I think people have become, because of all this imagery of actually showing certain demographics being killed, there has been a desensitization. It's like the dehumanization of black and brown people, people that are killed by police officers. And I think that that's a strategy. I think that that is something that also needs to be looked at. It causes mental health issues.
On whose part?
On the viewer. The viewer that's destructive to your mental health. To be seeing these images over and over of certain demographics is making people feel as though certain people can be dehumanized in death and others can't.
No, I wonder, when you consider the amount of police brutality during the time of Rodney King that did not come to light.
We didn't all have cell phones. with
Yeah,
cameras.
We didn't know about it then,
And that's
but
one
it
thing-
still went on.
That's one thing I wanted to say is, yes, we're seeing it over and over again, and so we're getting desensitized to it. But also, it wouldn't be brought to our attention if we didn't all have cell phones in our pockets and video cameras. So it's being brought to light that that these police officers are doing these types of crimes to society, and again, it's they're the ones doing it. We're not doing it. We're just bringing it forward.
I like that. I got somewhat of a different perspective. So I think about historically when it came time when lynching was taking place in this country, right? There was over 3,455 plus whatever number, that I'm not specific to the number, but about that many, was happening all around the country between 18, I want to say, if I remember correctly, 64 to, let's say, 1994. There's a time period that's been calculated to understand how lynching was taking place. But never in the time span of lynching did we become desensitized to lynching. And for me, though mass media has really bombarded us with the wrongs of the police, it has actually tampered with the jury pool. So, and what I'm saying is that there was a time period when officers were never ever found guilty. I don't care how bad they were, it was just so rare. But today, in the last 5 years, across the United States, officers are being found guilty because of jury pools just questioning their integrity and doing their job. So in many ways, the bombardment of mass media, or not mass media, but social media to the community has also affected that jury pool. We'll say 12 white jurors to begin now to question the idea of whether this officer did his job right or not. And so that's why just today we had Jordan Baker in Houston, I believe it was. The officer just got 15 years. Last week, the officer that killed Corey Jones got 15, I forget the years, but he was convicted. And the week before then, there was another officer found guilty. So
And I do know the one in South Carolina.
the one in
who
South Carolina
shot the man in the back.
Right. That was really the beginning of the turning point, because he wasn't found guilty for the criminal act. He was found guilty for the civil rights violation. So he was found guilty in the civil trial versus the criminal trial, where he pleaded that he preferred to be found guilty there versus going through a criminal trial and being found guilty and going to prison. So he did get, I think, 20 years. But my point is this. Never have we seen in history, like we're seeing today, officers are actually being sent to prison. They don't happen in the state of California because of the secretiveness of the state.
And also,
The police
I think,
officers' Bill of Rights.
Because of the Police Officers Bill
also,
of
I
Rights.
think all an officer has to say now is that he or she feared for their life, and that justifies their action.
Well, what
So
happens?
that's something that has to be changed.
Right. What happens? Their officers are trained that if they can articulate why this particular shooting occurred, their articulation is accepted as reason why the shooting is justifiable. So many officers are trained, not only are you trained on how to shoot and how to kill, but they also train on how to articulate the situation.
And
so-
they're given 10 days to do so before they have to make a public statement.
Right.
So that gives them a lot of time to talk to a lawyer.
What happens also is that if you look at it, sometimes many of those officers, I shouldn't say many, but some are released from the police department,
Yeah.
that they're deemed unfit.
Well, that's
While
why
they
I say
haven't been convicted in court, they are at least released.
That's
Well,
why I say that's a deceitful way that Richmond scooted this guy off the police force, which, like, again, thank God he's not a police officer no more.
Well,
But
that's what I was-
they did
let
it
me
in
clarify.
an ugly way.
Yeah,
but
let me
it might
clarify.
be deceitful, but at least that person isn't on the force.
No,
and
let me-
that is a way where it doesn't directly
Let's
say he
clarify
was
that.
guilty.
Most officers, especially here in the state of California, quit or transfer, given the appearance that they was taken off the force. They're never really just taken off the force unless they go into prison.
Now, there was one, I'm thinking, you know, the one who shot this man, he was sitting in his car and his fiance was recording.
Oh, Castile.
Yes,
Philando
yes,
Castile.
yes.
Fernando
He was
Castile.
not convicted in court, but he was later released by the police department. And he wasn't transferred anyplace else.
Right, so here we go again. He committed a criminal act instead of facing the prosecution of what a jury might come back with because of what the video will show and how social media has proved that he was guilty. He quit. So that's my point. Most of these officers, based on the fact that they know that they're guilty, will retire mostly with a pension first. And then those that do quit and maybe stay off the job for 10 days, 30 days, or 60 days, and then get rehired in New York. So they didn't never really quit. It was a strategy move because if they get fired or go to prison, you see what I'm saying? It's a big difference. So instead of getting fired, I will voluntarily resign.
In the time that we have left, let's talk about AB 392.
Real quickly, the officer that shot Derek Gaines in San Bruno is now in San Francisco on the police force, and he shot another man. So it's a pattern and practice thing, you know. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry. The Assembly Bill 392.
Yes.
Yes.
You got a call from the governor in terms of it. Let's talk about it.
Oh,
The bill puts some restrictions on what's necessary
right.
in
so,
terms of the use of force and what's
changes the
excessive use
language
of
from-
force.
right.
Justified to necessary.
So when we talk about AB 392, we're talking about a piece of legislation that just common sense legislation about savings line. Actually, this shirt represents AB 392, as you can see on the sleeve. And all this is a piece of legislation that has taken into account how heinous the killing has been in the state of California, and that we need common sense legislation to hold officers accountable and to consider de-escalation tactics. So when we talk about it, we looked at it in the sense that the incident that an officer, when he kills someone, is only taken from that time period, within seconds of the shooting. Not so much the totality of the event. Because the totality of the event, when you look at it, can really determine on whose fault it is that that young man was killed. And so we had looked at the standard, which is the oldest statute on the California books from 1872, that really emphasized reasonable officer.
Reasonable use of force.
Or what a reasonable officer would have done under the same circumstances. Okay. And so that has been the standard that has allowed, on a regular and consistent basis, why people are killed in the state of California, no officer is held accountable, because they can articulate that what a reasonable officer would have done. And so we looked at, is it necessary, changing the standard from reasonable to necessary, which holds them to a higher standard. And so there's been some challenges with the language, you know, that I have to be honest with as a impacted family member. But I think the intent of our legislation is ultimately going to do what we hope it does, and that is open the door for officers to be held accountable for the murders they commit in our community.
We have 1 minute left, and I'm just going to kind of go around the table in the 1 minute for final words. JT?
Final words, I just, I would hope that people can start taking a look at this topic, the general public, take a look at this topic, even if you haven't been impacted or you haven't, you're not aware of it personally. Just start becoming more aware, do more research, and find out more about it.
Richard?
I would say without the transparency that we're striving for here and accountability also, how can we ever have trust in the police department? And that's all we're trying to do is trust our police department like the good old days, and we're not trying to demonize anybody. We're just trying to make them use the best practices to save our young one's life. I don't wish this on anybody. You know?
Sure. Cephas?
I would say the legislation we just recently had passed, SB 1421, is transparency legislation. We also have data legislation that has passed that shows that everything that we say is so true, that there are many lives that are being killed by the police throughout the state of California. And so what we're doing now is bringing the accountability piece in, to hold officers accountable for the wrongs that they commit. And so it's our hope that the community, the state of California residents, are clear on what 392 does, and it's simply about saving lives.
Well, I'd like to thank the three of you for sharing your perspectives, and we will certainly look at the legislation and do everything we can to make sure that more lives are being saved. So thank you very, very much. And of course, and I'd like to thank our viewers for watching. Until next time. Well, thank you so much, JT.